Today is Thursday, January 18th, 2024. My name is Judy Herrera, and I'm in Camarillo, California. It is my honor and pleasure to interview Clifford Moore on behalf of the Conejo Valley chapter of the Daughters of the American Revolution and Colonial Dames 17th Century for the Veterans History Project with the Library of Congress. This interview is being recorded by Ed Lynch from Advana Videography and contains the reflections and memories of the veteran during his time in the Navy. This is Cliff's story. You were born in Hot Springs, Arkansas in December 1945 to Alvin and Dorothy Moore. You had a younger brother, Mike, before your parents split up. Your mom would remarry to a man you called Dad, Odell Tankersley.
That's it.
They would add 3 more children to the family. Odell was an electrician and followed the jobs wherever they took him. You moved often between 1951 and 1956. Then your uncle encouraged the family to move to California. Do you want to pick up your story there?
Well, that's a good early summary. I think we moved to California because my dad was following the work, and there was a lot of work in California in the 50s. The war was over, and big boom in housing. So we came and moved to a place in Los Angeles, and my brother and I, along with my other siblings, my half-siblings, we pretty much fit right into California. We were we lived next door to my aunt and uncle, and so there were 9 kids all together. Oh. And so we had a built-in play group, so to speak. During that time, I really, I was a young kid at the time, 10. I think I was in the 5th grade actually, and so the elementary school was right around the corner. We walked to school. Everything was right there for us, and so as I grew up, I began to think about what I wanted to do in the future, and I went to, at that time, I went to 3 junior high schools, and then when I was in Arkansas and Pittsburgh and Kansas City and Montana, other elementary schools. So I had a lot of experience with school, not the same school, but different schools. So when we were in Los Angeles, I went to 3 elementary and then later on 2 high schools. Okay. And it wasn't because we moved around a lot, it was just that they were building new schools at that time, and so each time I would get transferred to a different school. So my schooling was, my academics were good for the most part. I don't know that I loved school, but I did well in school, and it was primarily so I wouldn't disappoint my parents. And so we, as we grew up, me being the oldest, I think everyone kind of looked to me for certain direction, and so I took that on and I accepted that. But as I was going through my childhood, I ended up my last year and a half of high school at a Carson High School in the city of Carson, and we had already moved from Los Angeles to Gardena, and today it's Carson. My parents bought their first house with a GI Bill, and it was around I don't know. I think she said it was like $12,000.
Oh gosh! And
a small house of about 1,000 square feet, one bathroom for 7 of us. And so we lived there. We didn't have a lot of money. My dad, as an electrician, was a kind of a blue collar worker, but we never had a problem with food or clothing or anything of that nature. So we felt like we had a great childhood. So in high school, I was, like I said, an average student, although my last year I went to a counselor when I transferred to Carson High School, and he said, "So what's your future look like?" And I said, "Well, I want to go to college." Everyone said I want to go to college, and he looked at my earlier grades and he said, "Well, you're not going to go too far with these grades." So for the next year and a half, my junior and senior year, I really applied myself and did very well. And when I left when I graduated in 1964, I wasn't sure what I wanted to do, but I knew I didn't want to go to college at the time. I just wasn't. I'd kind of burnt out in school, and so my goal after high school was to be a long haul truck driver. I have no idea what in the world. I had a friend of mine we had this dream together. We were going to go out on the road and, buy our truck and just travel across the country. But that never happened, luckily. So what I ended up doing after high school was I was hired by Sears and Roebuck in their catalog store in Redondo Beach, California, and I worked there for a year, and I loved it because it was right near the beach, and so I could go to the beach just about any time, before work, after work, on the weekends. And then as 1965 sort of wore on, I had been advised by my international relations teacher in high school about a place in Southeast Asia called Vietnam. And at the time, she looked around the class and talked to each of the guys about, you better pay attention because you could be here. And the war, of course, had in '64 was not quite as big as it was in '68. And so we had advisors and some combat troops there, but it was beginning to heat up. And the year I graduated, 1964, was when the Tonkin Gulf Resolution was passed, and that really accelerated, the course of the war. So I paid attention, but I still didn't really know too much about Vietnam or Southeast Asia, and I didn't worry too much about it. So during my year working with Sears and Roebuck, I ended up in my spare time playing a lot of softball. I played 2 or 3 nights a week, and that was my form of recreation, and it kept me on the straight and narrow. And so I ended up having really good friends with a good buddy of mine, and as we began to talk, and after the games and everything, he said, I've been thinking about joining the Navy Reserves. He said the war over there is really beginning to accelerate, and he said, I've got an idea. He said, I've checked into it I've really done the research. He said, it's a 1-year reserve, a 2-year active duty, 3-year reserve, a total 6-year commitment. He said, but that war is going to be over with in no time. He said, it's Vietnam's such a small country, and look at the United States, what we have. And he said, so what will happen is we'll serve the reserves. They may not even need us for active duty. And he said, this way we're not going to be subject to a draft and, maybe go into the Army or the Marines, and that we weren't really excited about doing that. So I said, well, that sounds like a good plan, So I went home, talked to my parents about it, and my father, my biological father, had served in the Airborne Army after Korean War. So he was in the military for about 8 years. My stepfather was in the Air Force. So both had military background, and I wasn't super patriotic, but I felt like there was a calling and a duty that you had to protect. And at the time, we really thought the cause for Vietnam was a just cause. Turns out maybe it wasn't so just after all, but we ended up joining the reserves. And so that first year, it was great. I decided, in addition to that, I would go back to school, and so I enrolled in a community college, Los Angeles Harbor College, and so I thought I'm covered both ways. I'm in the reserves, and I've got a college exemption, so I'm in good shape. So I ended up that first year of college. I ended up playing baseball on the baseball team. I really had a great college experience. And so then the next year in '66, I was finishing my second year of college, and I was coming to the place where my active duty was going to be fulfilled.
You want to back up 1 second? You want to talk a little bit about what you did when you were in the reserve that year?
Yes, in the reserves, we had a monthly reserve meeting. I served on the U.S.S. Cormorant, which is a minesweeper.
Right.
And we did our in Long Beach Naval Station, we'd go on a weekend and do our duty. And then in the summer, we did a summer cruise. And usually it was somewhere up San Francisco, up to Washington, somewhere around, and do a 2-week cruise that we kind of really did all the things that you would do on a Navy ship.
Okay.
So we weren't specialized at that time. We were basically, we did it all. We raised the anchor. We did the supply ordering. We did everything that we would do in different functions of the Navy ship. So
Okay.
that was the year of the reserve.
Okay.
And so then, as we're getting closer, I graduated with my AA degree, and it was that time when I was being called for active duty. I got my orders within a month after graduating, and the orders were to, at that time I was advised that I had been accepted to what they call Class A school, and it was a storekeeper or supply and logistics. And so I was excited for that because I felt like that was my strength, organization and math and counting and all of that. So I ended up looking forward to that Class A school, and it was in San Diego, so it was close. And so during that time, it was a 10-week school. I was based there in the barracks there at San Diego, but on the weekends I was able to come home. We didn't really have anything like watch, or they wanted us to focus on the study. And so we dove right in. I ended up really kind of enjoying it. My time in Class A school there, we had an instructor who had a great sense of humor, and so he really made it fun. We had 30 guys in our school, in our class. And in that class, out of the 30 guys, I became pretty close with 2 or 3 of them. And but usually on the weekends, instead of going out somewhere in San Diego, I ended up going home because I had a girlfriend at the time, and so I went home to visit. And so at that time, I began to really apply myself in the Class A school. And so me and one other guy, we were vying for the top spot, the honors, what they call the honor spot. And I kind of naively thought, that'll give me a little edge in my next duty station. Maybe I'll be able to go to a great place like Hawaii or Morocco or Cuba or somewhere like that. So anyway, I went through school the 10-week period, and as we're going through our schooling, about halfway through, we filled out our dream sheets. Our dream sheets were, where would you like to be for your next duty station? And so we had all kinds of options. It could be on a ship, a land base, it could be in country, out of country. So I put my 3 down. I don't remember exactly what they were, but I'm sure they were like Long Beach and Hawaii and somewhere like that. And as the class wore on, the 10-week period, all the other guys were getting their orders, and I wasn't getting mine, and a couple other buddies weren't getting the orders either. And so I kept wondering, okay, what's going on here? And our instructor said, don't worry, your orders will all come in, you'll have a duty station. And 2 days before the end of class, I get my orders. And they were to an LST, home-based in Yokosuka, Japan. I had no idea what an LST was. I didn't know where Yokosuka, I knew where Japan was. I didn't know Yokosuka. And so as a result of that, I had to do a lot of research, and I did it, very quickly to see what am I getting myself into. My other buddy also got an LST, and he was on a ship that was a sister ship to mine. So we both went to Japan, and so I kept wondering, why I didn't get any of my choices that I had. And I really think that it was because they never probably even looked at those at all.
No.
So come to find out later on, I was selected as the honor student of the class, and my buddy came in as second, and both of us ended up on LSTs. But I thought that was kind of interesting and coincidental, or maybe not. So
And they sent a letter to your folks.
they did. I have a copy of a letter that my parents received. My mom, over all the years, saved everything that I sent home from my time overseas, and she did a scrapbook. And in there, I found that letter that they had sent to her, that I was the honor student of the class.
Yay.
So I thought, man, this is going to get me somewhere. I don't know where, but as it turned out, it was kind of a mixed blessing. So now I had to wait for my next step in my orders, which was to go overseas, and I ended up with I think it was about a two-week leave that I had before I had to go, and so I was able to spend a Thanksgiving and say my goodbyes to family. And I don't remember a lot about that. I just remember my mom has a picture of me sitting on my sea bag the night before I left. Oh. And it was kind of one of those pictures that is etched in her memory. Mm. And I don't remember a lot about if I was afraid, if I was, I just kind of accepted what I was doing as a part of the next step of my life.
How old were you at this point?
I was, that would have been 67. I would have been 22.
Okay. Well, so young, you know.
And that was about the average age of the Vietnam vet. There were a lot of them that were much younger. But I actually, I left for San Francisco in early December of 67, and I spent my birthday, December 16th, in San Francisco, waiting for my next step. I figured, usually I was told that once you got to San Francisco, they shipped you out to your base within a couple of days. Well, I was there for, I think, 17 days. Wow. And I was trying to figure out, I didn't even think about that at the time. I know I had my birthday there. I don't remember a lot about it. I mean, we were a bunch of guys just waiting to be shipped out. Yeah. And it wasn't until I started writing my memoirs that I found out why I was there for so long. Huh. And the reason is that I had been able to get into the National Archives and see my ship's logs for the whole time that I was overseas. And I saw that prior to me coming to the ship in mid-December, they were down in Vietnam in Da Nang, and they were on a mission. And so they weren't going to put me into the ship down there, so they waited till it came back to the home port, which was later in December, right before Christmas. So then the aha moment was there, like, oh, that's the reason I was in San Francisco for all those, and I never knew that for all these years, decades, that I never, and not that it was that important, but it was one of those unique things that I was told I'd be out there, on my duty station in a few days. So then I finally get my orders that we're going to be flying out to a place called Yokota Air Base, which is north of Tokyo. And that air base, I flew from San Francisco to Alaska. And the one thing I remember about that trip primarily is that when we landed in Anchorage, it was snowing. Of course, it was December. Yeah. And so ice had developed on the wings, and so we had to wait until they were able to get clear the ice off of the wings before taking off. So we flew out on our way to Yokota, and a vivid memory I have of that, and like so many military guys, there's certain things that like stick in your mind. And so I think that was the first time I had been on a plane. I'm not 100% sure, but I think it is. Okay. And so we're getting ready to land in Yokota, and it was a very, very foggy morning. And so as the plane is on the descent, we were looking out of the window and we see fog, 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 and all of a sudden the pilot guns it and takes off again. And so he comes back on the mic, and he says, we're going to do a fly around here. We got some pretty bad weather, and we're not able to do an approach, so we're going to do it again. So it comes back around, going descent, 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 And all of a sudden, second time, he guns it and takes off again. And he comes back on, he says, okay, no problem here, we've done this before. You know, he kind of assures us that this is a natural thing. So he, on the third approach, he finally is able to break through and land. And so, of course, everyone erupts in applause. And so, that was my first experience in Japan. And of course, not being I was a novice in flying, and so I really had no idea. I thought, here we go. I haven't even got to my duty station, and I'm going to die. But it turned out well. And so, another interesting thing that happened. From the Yokota Air Base, I took a bus. They had a bus that would take me to my ship in Yokosuka. And when I boarded the bus, I sat down, and I had a guy tap me on the shoulder and said, "Cliff, is that you?" And I turned around, and it was a buddy of mine who had joined the Navy before me. He was a very good friend in my church when I grew up in a church. We had a big social group, and he was just there. He flew in from Sasebo, where he was stationed, and it was just one of those coincidental things that it's funny because he said, you know, my mom prayed that we would connect, and she said, I told her, Japan is a big place, and how can that happen? And sure enough, so we had a couple of days there to kind of connect, and
nice.
It was really a fun time, and kind of a good time for me because I immediately found someone that I knew and was familiar with. So from that bus ride, they took me to my ship. I got on my ship in early December, and was able to kind of adjust. I had a couple of weeks there. We spent Christmas there, and then we got our orders. We were going to be among the very first of the support ships for the Mobile Riverine Force.
Okay.
And
what did they do? Do you want to maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, the Navy had not had an inland waters force since the Civil War.
Yeah.
And so it became very clear during the course of the war that the Mekong rivers and the Delta was going to be a very strategic place for a lot of reasons. Large population there, easy to ship things in, down the rivers, the supplies and the ammunition and the weapons. And so the Navy came up with the idea of having a joint task force of Army, and it would be a regiment from the 9th Infantry, and then amphibious assault craft, including small boats, swift boats, PBR boats. There were 5 different small boats that were part of this, and then some support ships, and LST was one of them. The LST support ship was a flat-bottom boat that could navigate the inland waters. And so the draft on that was about, when all the ballast was pumped out, it was probably about 8 feet. So it was a very shallow draft. And so that LST, the Washtenaw County and the Westchester County, were the first 2 LSTs that were assigned to that task force. And so we rotated in and out of the river, usually 3 months on, 2 months off. And so that, at the time, I had no idea what the Mobile Riverine Force was, but going back after the fact and looking at what happened, that Mobile Riverine Force became a very, very important part of the war, and it kept the Delta region very, very well, relatively safe, and so and secure. So that was the role of the Washtenaw County in that. As I did a little research, I learned that we were called the Brown Water Navy, and also the Gator Navy, and it was because of the brown waters, the silt and everything that from the Mekong rivers that were very brown looking. Uh, and so we went down in January of 1968. We had transported food, supplies, ammunition, and we had dropped it off in Da Nang. And then we went into Vung Tau, which is the entrance to the Mekong Delta. And it was then that, we kind of got our baptism by fire into the combat on the river. We did a transit up the river, and there's a number of rivers in the Mekong. There's the Mekong River, but then there's the Basek, there's the Mito, there's the Cochin, there's many rivers. And they start in China. I mean, that delta area, the rivers start in China and run, I don't know, maybe 2,500 miles. So it's quite a river system. So as we're getting adjusted to a combat zone, I'm less than a month from not civilian life, but from being in the United States. And now here we are, I'm watching all of this going on around me. And initially, they want you to become very sober and aware about you're in a combat zone. It may not seem it, but you are. And so one of the first duties was assigned to assist with what they call graves registration. And the graves registration was a system whereby body bags were being flown in to the from the battles that particular day, and usually at nighttime they brought them into places like the LST support ship, which had below deck about 6 or 8 refrigerated units that would hold bodies until they could be transported to Saigon and then flown back to the United States. So it was there that, in that case, we, there were, luckily, I was only doing that for a couple of weeks because I was ready to get into my supply department and to do the things that I was trained to do in my supply department. But the body would be coming in. You would remove one of the dog tags that they had. Usually, you had 2 dog tags. For the life of me, I don't know why, and I didn't save. I cannot to this day find my dog tags.
Oh.
And usually those are something that you would keep.
Yeah.
But anyway, then you would register the name, the serial number, and blood type, and things like that. And then the body would be taken down into what you call the tank deck, which is that open area in an LST where supplies and ammunitions and all the stores were kept. And so after that period of time, I knew I was in a combat zone. It was very evident. Even though sometimes it looked far, you could see the tracers and the flashes, and it looked like 4th of July or something, but it definitely was not a 4th of July kind of celebration. That was my introduction. And then as we progressed into January of 1968, was the Tet Offensive that the Viet Cong had planned. And during the Tet holiday, usually there would be a ceasefire. But they had strategically planned to hit all of the major places in the Delta as well as throughout South Vietnam. And it was a very coordinated attack. And so we were right in the thick of the Tet Offensive in 1968. We were in the river from early January until early April. So that was at the height of the Tet Offensive. And throughout that time, we had a number of situations and incidents, and it was something that I was reminded, and it's not something that was original with me, but someone said that war is long periods of boredom punctuated by moments of sheer terror. And so I could identify with that because much of our time in the river was just everyday stuff. You know, you weren't in combat. You were just preparing for those few moments of maybe terror. And so, luckily for us, what we did was we navigated up and down the rivers, intercepting the little sampans, which were the Vietnamese boats that sometimes would be carrying ammunition, or they'd be hiding Viet Cong. And so we were moving up and down the river in kind of the search for those sampans, and quite often we would be hit from the riverbanks. And so either rocket or recoilless rifle fire or mortars. And so we were kind of a sitting target, so to speak, throughout the war. And we had armament. Some of those smaller boats did not, even though they did have some armament on them, but they were not. They were very vulnerable to, especially to rocket fire.
So you had you had the 50 calibers on your ship, on each side. You
Yes.
did have some.
The armament on our ship was, we had three, well, we call them gun tubs. And each of the gun tubs had twin 50 caliber, 3-inch 50 caliber guns. And those shells were quite large. I mean, they were 3 inches diameter. That's where you get the 3-inch. And then we also had 30 millimeter machine guns. But our big armament for shore bombardment was the 3-inch guns that we used. When we were on watch, especially swim watch, we had our recoilless rifles and our 30 caliber machine guns that we used, as well as percussion grenades that we would throw into the water to keep the Viet Cong swimmers from, hopefully keeping them from swimming in the water. And what they would do is they would swim underneath and put mines underneath, because it's such a shallow draft.
Yeah.
They were able to get those
under.
mines underneath. So that was our armament, and we used that quite a bit. But we were not able. Most of our firing was in retaliation. We had orders that we were not to fire unless we were fired upon, and so that kind of that tied our hands a little bit in a lot of situations, because we might be aware of certain situations that we could fire on, but because we had friendly troops a lot of times in the jungles that we might not be aware of. So it was not a typical warfare that you would find from World War I, World War II, even Korea. This was a totally different kind of warfare, and guerrilla warfare was not something that we had fought in before.
No.
In 1968, there was we had at about 3 o'clock in the morning, we were called to general quarters, and this would have been in March of '68, as the Tet Offensive is kind of winding down, and we were attacked from the shore with mortar rounds, rocket fire, and so we were called to general quarters. My role in general quarters, which is battle stations, was to be a loader on the 3-inch guns.
Okay.
And so our gunners' mates were the ones who did the actual firing. We were there to pass and load onto the end of the guns, the shells. So we were on general quarters at 3 o'clock. We had been, our sister ship, or one of our sister ships, the Benoit, which was like a support berthing quarter ship, was hit the worst. And it was hit below the waterline, so it began to list and to sink. Luckily, everything that was fired at us was fired short. However, and luckily, because had it hit the tank deck, all the ammunition that's stored there would have gone up in a ball of flames. But what I remember about it, the reason I'm bringing it up is because it was early on in my time on the ship, and this was my first, my first time in the river, and I remember thinking as I'm handing the shells to the gunner's mates, I'm only been here a month and I'm going to die. I mean, it was that kind of a visceral feeling where, because I could hear the mortars hitting the water, and they kept getting closer and closer. And it was at that time our gunner's mate, I can't remember his name, but as we're hearing these splash closer and closer to us, he decides, without permission from the gunnery officer, that we're going to fire, and so he did. And luckily, it turned out okay, even though they disciplined him for firing without it being acknowledged, but from the command. And so, what was interesting though is that it looked like the mortar stopped shortly after that. So we feel like that at least that had made an impact. And but later on, a number of months later, there was a commendation that was given to the officer who had not given the orders. And so it was one of those ironic things as they were presenting this commendation to him. People in the crew kind of knew that that's not the way it really went down. But that was sort of, I guess, happened probably more often than not. That was an incident where where I was really afraid, probably the most fearful that I'd been during the time there. And I'd always felt that I had been very lucky, to go through that time period. And that wasn't the only time that we were fired upon during my time there, but it was one of the ones that was, to me, probably the most emotional and maybe fearful that I had at that time. Later on that year, we were during our time, we were involved in a number of campaigns. They were called Market Time, Game Warden, Sea Lord. Those were all names of particular campaigns, and each of them had various components to it. And so one of them that we were doing, and I probably should back up here because the task force that we were primarily involved with was Task Force 117, and that was the Mobile Riverine Force. But we were also attached to Task Force 115, which was the Coastal Surveillance Force. And Market Time and Game Warden had been so successful during 1968 that we had cut off most of the supply that was coming in, the Viet Cong were bringing into the Delta. But there was, they became creative and they started another supply route through Cambodia.
Oh, yeah.
And so Cambodia became the supply route that we had to next address. And so that was the formation of the Coastal Surveillance Force, because that one was a search and destroy mission for the Cambodian supply routes. And so we were assigned to that in late 1968, in October of 1968, and our ship went to a place called Phu Quoc Island. Phu Quoc Island today is a resort. But in those days, in 1968, it was a very stronghold, hiding place for the Viet Cong. Okay. And so in this Coastal Surveillance Force, our ship supported a Navy SEAL team, or a couple of Navy SEAL teams, and a couple of Cobra gunships that were used to bring the Navy SEALs and drop them into the island and then off again. So we were a little bit offshore. Okay. And and we also did some bombardment at that time. The guns that we had could go effectively 8 miles.
Oh.
So they were pretty effective at 8 miles. But in this particular Fuquoc Island, in this particular mission, what I remember about it was, well, two things. One is we had the Cobra gunships that we had. They were the AH-1, what they call AH-1 Cobra fighters, and there were about 1,000 to 1,200 of them that served in Vietnam during that time, and they were about $10 to $11 million each. So they were a pretty expensive tool. But on one particular night, and I remember I was out on the deck. They were coming in. The two Cobras were coming in from their mission, and it was at nighttime, probably about 8 o'clock at night. And we on our ship, we had a helicopter pad, so you could easily land 2 helicopters on it. It was that big. So first helicopter landed. Second helicopter comes in, and he begins his descent, and all of a sudden he does a go around and he doesn't land. Comes back around, and we're looking at him. He's maybe 30 yards off the ship, and he starts to descend, and we're watching, and he descends right into the water. Mm-hmm. And all I kind of remember is the lights of the helicopter, and then the whop 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 of the blades hitting the water, and then he sinks. And we're confused about what's going on, and so we wondered. We sent. They were able to the helicopter pilot and his buddy were able to escape and swim. We sent out a boat to get them, and then a diver went out and marked the spot so salvage could come in later and get the helicopter.
Yeah.
But I thought, boy, that was about a $10 million mistake. So to this day, and I've read many accounts of it since that time,
Really?
but to this day, we're not sure if he got scared that he was going to hit the other. We have what they call a windsock on the deck, and if he was going to hit that, or if he just kind of panicked and didn't know what to do. Never heard what happened to him, but there was really never any indication that he was disciplined or anything. I don't know, but that was a very interesting situation for someone to. I mean, those were expensive helicopters.
Yeah.
Of the 1,200 or so helicopters, I read a statistic that over half of them were lost in combat. So that's what I remember because we had so many helicopters coming in and landing on our deck, is that some of these guys were so young and they were flying, and to know that over half of those were lost in some kind of combat was a pretty amazing statistic. Yeah. The other, in 1968, towards the end, it was when we were at Fuquoc Island that we received a message that the U.S.S. Westchester County had been mined, and there was a lot of loss of life. So we were given orders to go into the river and we were to what's the word I'm looking for? We were to relieve the Westchester County, even though it had not completely sunk. It had been able to get to the repair base, Dong Tom. Okay. And so we were there to relieve the Westchester County. Mm-hmm. And so it took us about a week to get to them. But once we got there, we were able to see the extent of the damage, and the fact that we took all the stores that they had, put them on our ship, and it turned out that there were over I think there were 28 Navy that were killed, and a number of other Army, some Army and some others, and over 40 wounded. So it was the single the single largest loss of life in the Vietnam War for the Navy. It was during that time. And it was something that, I thought, except for fate, the grace of God, who knows, it could have been our ship just as easily as it was their ship, because we rotated back and forth with them. So it was a sobering kind of thing. The ship was able to limp back to the Philippines and then to Japan and get repairs, and within 3 months it was back. Yeah, and so that was something that they were very good at, is repairing those ships. So I think that was important for me to process and to recognize the fact that those guys lost their lives, and that this particular incident was really evidence of how serious it was on the river. There were many other times when the Viet Cong frogmen had placed mines underneath, but this was the single largest loss of life. And during that time, there were 2 ships that were highly decorated. I mean, I'm kind of, I guess, bragging a little bit. It's not me. It was the ship. And the Washtenaw County and the Westchester County were both highly decorated. The Washtenaw County was the most highly decorated ship of the Vietnam War. And if you look at the awards that they received, and it wasn't so much like the combat action awards and all of the unit commendations and all of those. To me, the most important ones were the Battle Efficiency Award, which was a whole crew award. We had the Navy Supply Excellence Award for 2 years in a row, which was unheard of. And so we received that. We had the engineering, the red E. So they all had different colors. The battle one was the white, the supply was blue, the red for the engineering. So those awards were displayed on the ship, and they were prominently displayed, which made us all very proud to be a part of that. So I think that was something that I felt very, very strongly, and probably the most proud of those kinds of awards than any kind of single award. A lot of the people that served in Vietnam I talked to didn't really get to know or even meet their commanding officers. And one of the nice things about an LST is that you had a crew of 175, and of that there were I think about 18 officers, and the commanding officer was just one of the guys. And I was fortunate enough during my time to have 3 commanding officers. They are all lieutenant commanders at the time, and they commanded the ship at various periods of time. But the first one was Al Dillon, who was there through the beginning of Tet. He ended up a change of command when we went to an R&R in Bangkok. Next was Jim Burpo, who was lieutenant commander through 1968 and part of 69. And then when I was leaving the ship, Roger Smallwood, lieutenant commander Smallwood. So 3 men who, during the course of that time, some of the guys got to know them very well. I didn't know them real well, but we could call each other by first names. In the combat zone, there was a formality and a chain of command, but it wasn't as formal as it might be on a regular Navy base or an Army base. There was a certain informality there that was kind of nice. And so, but getting to know them was very was very good, because even when we had reunions later on afterwards, they would show up, and so it was kind of nice to even get their perspective. And so I've read some of what I remember was from their memoirs that they wrote about our time there. All of them wrote some things that were very instrumental in helping me to remember kind of what was happening. One of the very interesting things during 1968 that I became familiar with was, because I was in supply, we did a lot of exchanging of things, even with the Vietnamese. And so we got to know, we had interpreters, and so we got to know a lot of what they had for us and what we had for them. So we would do some exchange stuff, but there was a program that the military had in 68 and 69, which was called Chu Hoi program. And it was an encouragement of the Viet Cong to defect. And so it was a defection, it was a call for them to defect. And so we would place flyers all throughout the combat zone that would encourage them, and it would give them certain benefits. They would get free passage, for example, and there were other things that they would look forward to if they enjoyed this, if they joined in this Chu Hoi program. And we had some of them that became what they call Tiger Scouts. And these were defectors who were now supposedly on our side. And so they would be, these Tiger Scouts would help, especially when it came time to know about the terrain and about the inlets of the river. They knew a lot, and so they were scouts that would help us basically. And we had interpreters who would work with them. And what I found out later, and I have a copy of it that maybe we'll take a picture of, but when one of the criticisms of the military in Vietnam was that they didn't understand the Vietnamese language very well, and nor made much attempt to understand it. When I found out I was going to Vietnam, I was given I think it was a 1941 or 1942 book of Chinese language phrases.
Oh, wow.
And that was what we were supposed to use in Vietnam.
Wow.
And so, it was to kind of, I think it was their way of doing a little check the box of, helping them with the languages. Or maybe they were so naive, the military is so naive to think that, Chinese, Japanese, Vietnamese, they're all the same language. I have no idea, but it was such a weird thing when I came home and later looked at, because I never used it the whole time there, to look at that book and say, what in the world were they thinking? So, but anyway, so that program was something, and the Chu Hoi program was something that was somewhat beneficial, although, to be honest, we never really trusted some of the information, the intel that was given to us. It was always a little suspect, because you never knew. They estimated that of the thousands that joined the program, that maybe 25% were really genuine. It's hard to know what that was, but it was something that at the time we felt like it was beneficial. If you could find someone who was trustworthy, who was Vietnamese, who could give you, okay, what's this hamlet like? What's going on here? And so we did depend upon it, but it was something that we really were a little skeptical of. Quite a bit.
Sure. Okay.
So during our after we relieved the Westchester County after the mining accident, we went to Hong Kong for a R&R. And I'd never been to Hong Kong, obviously. Never been in Southeast Asia. But Hong Kong was one of the great ports that we were able to, and it was during the time when it was still owned by the British. It was very much British. And so what I remember about that trip was going to the Red China border. And the border there, it was like a little field trip, I guess. I don't know. But I remember they had speakers that were directed towards Hong Kong, and they played propaganda music and other propaganda, these huge speakers. And I thought, that is just so odd. But, you know, thinking back now, that was eventually they would become mainland Chinese. And but Hong Kong, along with Bangkok and Taipei and Osaka, Japan, and many other home ports that we were able to visit, Okinawa, Korea. We had just so many places that we visited that were out of the limelight of combat. And so it was, you know, something that mainly we did a lot of training.
Okay.
And so, because these were transport ships, we would do a lot of training exercises, transporting vehicles, ammunition, all kinds of things to different places around Southeast Asia. So we had a tremendous, exposure to a lot there. Okinawa, the Philippines, I mean, it was just in that respect, it was a great experience.
Good.
So 1968 ends, and in 1969 we had another couple of trips to the river.
Okay.
And then I received word that, before, at the end of 1968, I had the option of going for another duty station or staying in, my current duty station. And I had mixed feelings on it, because during the time that you're on the ship in a combat zone, you got what they call hostile fire pay, or we called it combat pay. And there were a lot of perks to being in a combat zone. One was you got free postage. All of your earnings were tax exempt. So up to a certain point, I don't remember what that was, but I know you didn't pay taxes on it. And the postage thing was kind of cool, because you could send as much as you wanted postage free. And then the combat pay was actually pretty good. It was like around $65 or $70 a month, when we were only getting, I don't remember, maybe 150, and the rate that I was in at the time. So we were able to save a lot of money, because you weren't able to spend it anywhere. So those little perks were kind of nice. But so I was thinking about those things as I considered my next duty station. And so my supply officer pulled me aside and he said, the last 4 months of your enlistment is going to be in port in Japan we're going to be doing an overhaul. So we'll be, you'll be 4 months on base. So he said, you'll just have to get through the months of January to April. And we do have two different missions that are planned for the river. He said, but other than that, he said, it's up to you. But so I said, okay, I think I'll stay. And so I did. And because I was afraid, looking back on my Dream Sheet experience, I don't think I'd have much of a choice of, coming up with another great duty station. And so knowing that we were going to be in dry dock, home ported in Japan, and I'd be able to do some moving, back and forth, doing some sightseeing and things like that, I went for it. During the course of 1968, especially during the course of the war, we had very little communication back and forth to home. And during my entire stay overseas, I had, I think, one phone call that lasted a few minutes, and I remember vividly that it was 13 minutes $13 a minute for a phone call, and you had to go through a variety of operators to get to that phone call. And so I did, but we depended primarily upon mail.
Okay.
Letters back and forth, and I wrote a lot. My mom saved a lot of my letters that I wrote to her, and so we had letters, and mail call was important. We oftentimes would go weeks and weeks without it, but then we'd come into a port, and they would have saved our letters, because all the letters went through the Fleet Post Office in San Francisco, and then they would disperse them out to all the various stations across the Pacific. And so when you came into a port, you just waited for that mail call, and a lot of guys would be disappointed. Sometimes the guys would get baskets of food and boxes that had things. I even had my mom send my softball glove that I could use when I was playing on the softball base team. So the mail call was important, and it really, the morale of the troops was really just spiked when those letters came in. And we looked forward to them, and when they didn't, of course, we were obviously disappointed. My parents were, and my siblings were pretty good about writing. My girlfriend was really good the first year. The second year, not so good. That's when I knew things might not work out. So those, like I said before, those mail calls were really important. Then 1969 rolls around, and we did a number of times in the river. But what I was really looking forward to was that the last 4 months in Japan, we did we came in. They put us into a dry dock. The boat was, high and dry in a dry dock, and we did, for the supply department, we were given the task of inventory of everything on the ship that wasn't nailed down, and then of course the engine men were working on the engines. If there were any other issues related to the functioning of the ship, that was all taken care of in this. And it was about it actually lasted about 3 months. And during that time, I was able to spend time in all the facilities on the base. I mean, Yokosuka had a very, very good facility. They had great gymnasiums, great fields for softball and baseball, and gymnasiums and workouts, and they had a library of music that you could go in and tape, and I spent hours and hours and hours taping albums onto these 7-inch reels that today I still have. and I still have my Akai reel to reel. It's a 7-inch reel with a amplifier. That I bought this amplifier, a Sansui amplifier in Japan for like little money, and that thing I kept for 40 years. Wow. And I finally put it in my garage, and then finally a friend of mine bought it, and he still uses it to this day. Wow. So I kept that music library. I did a lot of I did some sightseeing. One of the cool things is we came into dry dock in April of '69, and to this day I don't know how I connected up with, but my cousin Ron, who I grew up with, and we were the ones that lived next to each other.
Right.
He was in the Navy on an aircraft carrier and flying off of an aircraft carrier, and his ship came into port the same week that we came back, and we laughed because just a month ago I asked him, how did we connect up? He goes, I have no idea. Today we have cell phones, we have text messages, we have all kinds of things. But in 1969, I don't know. I have no idea how we connected up. But I knew that he was coming in because his ship became the officer in charge of the ships that were in port at that time. And so I just happened to see in our logbook that the U.S.S. Kearsarge was in port. And I knew that he was on that ship. So maybe I went to it. I don't know. But anyway, we connected up and spent 2 days in Tokyo over a weekend and visiting. And so he was like a brother to me. Ron was really a brother as much as he was a cousin.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of a neat experience. But throughout that 4 months that I was there in dry dock, I really just, we worked like 8 hours a day doing our job. And then at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, whatever, then we had time to do our, recreation and whatever. And so it was kind of a good experience, and I was able to leave the ship there, not down in the combat zone, where it was a much scarier kind of situation for people who had to leave in that kind of a fighting zone.
Right. So how did you get back home?
Well, let me think about that. I got my orders in early August that I was to report to the Naval Station Long Beach for separation, which was an exciting time. I remember that I was to fly out of Yokota Air Base, which is the same place that I came into almost 2 years earlier. But it had been 20 months since I had arrived, and so I walked off the gangplane. I found it in my ship's logs through the National Archives, where I walked off my ship at 5:45 in the morning on December, whatever the not December, in August, whatever the date was. But and the guy that signed me out was a gunner's mate, a chief gunner's mate, who many years later I reminded him, which of course he didn't remember, at a reunion that we were at. But I remember taking another bus to Yokota Air Base, and we were on it wasn't a military plane, unlike the one I came over in. It was a charter plane that it was I think it was through World Airways or something, but it was like a commercial plane, a regular plane that was used to fly military and their families back to the States. And one thing I remember about the flight over is that I sat next to a lady who was like 8 months pregnant. She was the wife of a naval officer, and I was on the outside, she was on the inside, and she was up about every 30 minutes, and I thought, she's going to have this baby right here over the Pacific. And didn't happen, luckily. But I didn't get much rest on that, flight over to San Francisco. So went to San Francisco, didn't have to spend much time there, and then it was a short flight down to L.A. where my family met me. And I don't remember a lot about. In fact, I talked to my mom about this past weekend. I said, I don't remember much about that reunion. You would think that I remember this lady being pregnant, having to go to I remember something like that, but I don't remember the reunion, who was there. And I know that a lot of my family, I'm assuming my girlfriend, I don't even know for sure. And my mom said, I know I was there, she said. And one of my brothers was there for sure. Actually, both my brothers were there. And he said, one of my brothers, Mike, the one closest to me, said, what I remember about that meeting was, he said, your eyes were completely bloodshot. And he said, I thought for sure that you got into drugs, because we had heard about all the drugs in Vietnam. And he said, I was scared because I thought, he's fallen into that. Well, an interesting side note to that is that I decided that I would I would try contact lenses. And in 1968, they hadn't been perfected to the soft lens. They were the hard lenses. And so I had bought them about about a month before I left, and I was learning how to wear them. And I had worn them all in that flight, all the way from Japan to San Francisco and down into LA. So I don't know how many, and probably had them in for 12, 14 hours.
Gosh.
And so that was the reason for my bloodshot eyes. And I laughed and told my brother later about that. And he said he was glad of that. But so, but the drug use, and I was going to mention this earlier, but the drug use in Vietnam, I never really saw much drug use at all. A lot of the drug use and the fragging of the officers all came in the 70s, as the war was winding down. That was when most of that was happening. What I saw in my situation was a crew and all the guys that were on the boats, very professional. They had a job to do, and it was something that was taken very seriously. And if there was drug use, it was so uncommon because people needed to be very sharp, in those situations.
Yeah.
And so I mentioned to you yesterday, but I don't think I mentioned today, is that some of the guys that would use maybe Vietnamese alcohol, whiskey, or whatever, might get drunk and fall off their boats as when we were shifting locations in the river. So that happened occasionally, but it wasn't so common that it was a big problem, but it did happen. And then, there were those non-combat related deaths that you wonder about, how their parents were notified, but so the drug use is something that I didn't personally observe that much of at all.
Okay.
And everyone that I was, my commanding officers, all of my other officers, all of the enlisted, it was all very work-like, business-like. It's something, let's do a job and then move on.
Right.
So that was the extent of my observance of any kind of drug use.
Okay. Okay.
So now I'm home. I'm still in the military. So
that's true.
I'm heading to Long Beach Naval Station.
Okay.
And I had to report. Said I had to report by midnight of a certain date. And I saw in my orders that I reported at 11:50.
Goodness.
So I waited till the very last to get to that station. Even though it was going to be a good thing, but it took about 2 weeks to process me out.
Okay.
And they had to assign me to. I was assigned for my next 3 years reserve duty. I was assigned to a destroyer, the U.S.S. Delaney,
Okay.
and that was to be my reserve commitment for the next 3 years. I was finally separated in late August of '69, and I, of course, didn't get my discharge. I just got my separation papers and my DD-214 and all of that. And so first thing that I did is first of all, I have to say that in my time, even though I was exposed to a lot of combat action, it was not near what other guys experienced in that war. And I felt very fortunate. I felt like I did escape some close calls, but I was one of the lucky ones. And I think I was also one that was more normal than a lot, because a lot of times you look at the Vietnam veteran as some either, who came back and was on drugs and got into alcohol and didn't fit in, and while that happened to a lot of guys, that wasn't the norm. The norm was a guy like me who came back, did their service, and ended up going into the mainstream of civilization, so to speak, and went back to college, and that was the norm. And so the psychological effect that the war had hit people differently. Mm-hmm. And I felt like I was fairly grounded when I went over there, and I had I guess a good head on my shoulders, and so I made good decisions when I was there. Mm-hmm. Not everyone did that. Right. And I think I mentioned to you one of my buddies who really struggled with being there. He was homesick. When we went to Bangkok, he was a heavy drinker. He would go out and drink heavily any time of shore leave that he had. He really couldn't cope with what we went through, and he ended up committing suicide. Mm-hmm. And again, that was not the norm, but that was an example of how that affected certain people there. Mm-hmm. And it happened to the people who were in the jungle. It happened to some of the people on my ship, but that was not the norm. When you look at the 2.7 million people that served in country, 58,000 of them were on the wall, plus many more, tens of thousands wounded. But the mental aspect was also something that has hit very hard. And so I just want to say that I was fortunate, and so my experience is not the same as someone else that went through it. And I think that I did have a good foundation that allowed me to navigate a lot of the choices that I would have to make over there, and it allowed me to come back relatively in good mental health, but it didn't happen to everybody. So I did want to say that because I think that is important.
No, I do too.
I'm a part of a program. In fact, on Monday, I'll be going to the VA hospital in Westwood, part of a program called Million Veterans, and what it is it's a program to look at your overall health and how it's been impacted by your service. Okay. And so their goal is to get, and it's a voluntary program that you commit to, and so they'll come and they'll do blood work and some other things that they'll take, and they want to track certain diseases. They want to track things and how they've affected veterans over the course of ever how many years. So that's a program I know that'll be looking at the mental health aspect as well.
Oh, good.
So I have a 1:00 appointment on Monday.
Yay.
So it's kind of ironic that we're doing this interview.
Well, thank
today.
you for supporting that. That's a great.
I thought that was
thing.
something that was important.
Yeah, it is.
Where was I? Came back.
So you were home, and you were going to talk. You mentioned the other day that for 10 years as a civilian, you hadn't said anything.
Yes. So I came home, I went right to work in a retail setting, Jimco, a store called Jimco. Met my wife, who worked there too. We got married. In the meantime, I went back to school. I had 2 years of college, and so I wanted to finish my schooling. So we lived in a small apartment in Gardena while I finished my schooling. I played baseball at the University of Dominguez Hills that I went to. And then I had dreams to be a teacher. And then 1973, when I got my teaching credential, there were no jobs. And I was a little naive in thinking, I'll just go out and everybody will want me. And door closed after door closed after door closed. And so during my time in college, I was working as a technical writer for a computer company, and they said, why don't you come to work for us full time? We'll pay you more than you're going to make as a teacher anyway. And they were right. Teachers at the time were making $10,000 a year, and I was making $16,000 as a technical writer. So I said, okay, I'll do that. And so in the meantime, my wife and my wife's continuing to work. And so we work together, and then we moved to Orange County in Mission Viejo, and she works for computer sciences there. I make that commute for 4 years from Mission Viejo to El Segundo. And so I'm working as a technical writer, and I'm kind of thinking, well, my dream to be a teacher probably is gone. And so I worked through the gas crisis of the early 70s. All of those things. Our life is just going on. We have our first child in 1975, and so in '77 I get a phone call from a friend who was a minister at a church that we had gone to many years before, and he called out of the blue. I just returned from New Jersey on a trip that I was meeting with some bankers on some manuals that we were writing for the company, and my wife says, Forrest is on the phone. I said, Forrest? I said, I haven't talked to him in like 4 years. So he said, hey, what's your future look like for you and your wife? And I'm like, that's a strange question. And so he says, well, I got this friend, I'm in Camarillo, and I got this friend who is a superintendent of a school district, and they've got a retirement. And so he said, they might be looking for a teacher. He said, I can see if I can get you an interview. That's all I can do. Can't promise a job. I said, well, I don't even have a credential anymore. I let it expire. And so to make a long story short, I went back, did another quarter of classes to upgrade my credential, interviewed for the job. Today I look back and I think, how in the world could he have hired me? I had no experience other than my student teaching, and I just had a good connection with the principal. And so a month before school was to start, I was hired as a teacher in the Hueneme School District.
Nice.
And so to this day, I think it was kind of an act of God, because why in the world would this guy mention to this minister that he's got a guy that's retiring, and then he thinks of me thinking, oh, I know he wanted to be a history teacher at one time, and that was like 5 years prior. How in the, all of that came together. And so that was where I ended up going into education.
Oh, good.
And I taught 5 years in a junior high school at Blackstock. I got an opportunity to go to a new high school in Oak Park. I taught there for about 8 or 9 years, and then went into administration, became the principal of the high school there, and then ultimately assistant superintendent. And that was my career, which all stemmed from, believe it or not, the Vietnam War, because it was the GI benefits that allowed me to go back to college, because my family wasn't especially wealthy. And so that GI benefits at the time, my first GI benefit monthly payment was $175 a month, which was more than enough to cover my books, tuition. I went to a public university, so I didn't have any worries. I stayed at home. I lived at home. So that more than covered it. And then by the time I finished with my master's degree and my administrative credential, I was getting almost $400 a month through the GI.
Wow.
So it gave me more than enough to get my BA, my master's, and my administrative credential, and my teaching credential. So outside of that, I don't know that I would have been able to do it. You never know.
It's all meant to happen, right?
I think so.
is there anything else that you would like to share that you think we had, look over your notes, is there anything else there that you had wanted to share? And you're also a part of a veterans group, or you mentioned reunions, you stay in touch.
The Washtenaw County, we have a website that's maintained by some of the guys, has all the pictures and all the stuff for our unit. But every year, I think the first one was, I'm trying to remember, but at least for the last 20-something years, we've had a reunion. And it alternates between West Coast, mid U.S., and East Coast.
Okay.
And so I don't make all of them. The West Coast ones I really try to make, or sometimes on the East Coast if it's went to one in New Orleans, one in South Carolina. But they're usually attended by not huge groups, numbers, but somewhere in the neighborhood of anywhere from 40 to 80 people. And of course we were losing guys as each year passed, but I do belong to that reunion group.
Oh, good.
Yeah.
Oh, good.
And then I don't do a lot of other, I know the part that you were asking about. It was after I got home, I really was not anxious to share that I had been in the military, and for good reason. It was very controversial. There was still the anti-war group movement, and
protesting.
You never knew who was. You never knew what their view of the war was. So when I got back in '69, the war was still raging. It didn't end till '73, and actually '75 when the last troops were removed from the tops of the embassy. So there was a number of years there that we were uncertain, and so for a long time I didn't really talk about it. I would, people that I knew, there would be certain conversations, but I never really discussed it with my wife, with anyone much. A few people would ask every now and then, and then especially when I went into teaching, I didn't teach about it for a good 10 years.
Yeah.
And it wasn't until one of my former students came to me, who was attending University of Santa Barbara, who they had some classes just on the Vietnam War, and she came and asked me why. She says, "I think you're doing a disservice to your students by not." And so little by little, I incorporated that into my lessons. And what was interesting is that I have a very good friend. His name is Jim Johnson, who was another history teacher with me, and we did many things together, and Washington D.C. trips, and just lots of things. But he was a anti-war protester in the war. I went and served, and so teaching in the same department, we had a great relationship. And so we kind of played off of each other, because kids would ask us to talk to the classes.
Sure.
And so, he would give his perspective, I would give my perspective. And so we did a lot together on that. And so I began to incorporate things into my lessons. And I steered away from, the questions like, did you kill anyone?
Yeah.
Or did you, all of the, so we pushed that aside very quickly. But we would tell stories of realistic kinds of situations, but then it came time to where quite often I would be asked to speak on Veterans Days, especially at many of the schools in the district, or many of the schools in my son's school district. And for 3 or 4 years running, I did something at he had a huge assembly that brought all the students together, and they brought in Vietnam veteran, or not just Vietnam, but from Iraq, from other Afghanistan. So we were able to hear their story, and so little by little, I became more comfortable
Yeah.
with at least telling the story without feeling the emotion, that it might bring. And I think, again, it's because, I went through a lot, but nothing near as what some people really experienced. And so I really, I've seen some Vietnam movies. My first one was with my brother in the Apocalypse Now, and I related to you a story
Yeah.
about that. And Apocalypse Now, when I saw the movie, it didn't impress me as being realistic a bit, but because it was such a Hollywood, thing. But the more I thought about it, the more the movie, because it was a really crazy, mixed up movie, and I thought, kind of that's how the war was. And I think the director of that movie, that was part of the plan for how that movie played out. And so it was many years later, 2000, when I was principal at Oak Park High School, and we had a student who was the granddaughter of Martin Sheen. Martin Sheen played a pivotal role in Apocalypse Now. And so he was coming to speak to a group of our students. And when I had actually contacted him because CJ, his granddaughter, I had a reason to contact him for something. I don't remember what it was, but we had a chance to talk, and he said that he would be happy to come and talk to our kids. It was our theater arts group,
Okay.
and so he said he would love to talk to them. So when he came, he found out that I had been in the Mobile Riverine Force, the boats, as they call it in the river in the movie. And so we had a chance to talk in my office a little bit before, and he expressed to me how moving that film was for him, because he was at a dark time in his own life in the filming of that movie, and he was heavily drinking. He wasn't alcoholic; he's a recovering alcoholic, and he also had a heart attack on the set of that movie. And he said a lot of that craziness of that movie was also reflecting his own life at the time. And so we talked a little bit about what I did, or my role in there. And so he talked to the kids and was very, very inspirational, for them and to them. And so a couple of months later, I get on my desk some things from him. It was a screenplay from the Apocalypse Redux, which was a remake, not a remake, but it was a redo of the movie, and including about an hour plus of other footage. So it was a screenplay and he had inscribed some things to me in there, and he gave me a few other things that were related to the movie. And so that was very meaningful, that for me to be in that situation there, for him to do that movie, and then for us to connect so many years later was kind of a exciting thing. Yeah.
Another thing meant to happen.
Yeah. In growing up, I had always been kind of a serious-minded kind of kid, I guess. Although I appreciate humor immensely, but I'm not a humorist. And so when I left for Vietnam, I had a family who was very influential in my life. We have a very close family. And so I know that through my family and my mom, through her prayers, and through all of the influences that I had in my life, I felt like I was going to be okay over there, but I knew I had to make good choices. And so when I had the choice of going out and getting drunk in the bars, or going and playing basketball in the gym, I pretty much made that choice. Or there was many other choices of doing one thing or another. And so when I came back, I felt like that all of what I thought were good choices had been reinforced, and that it was going to help me in my maturity in later life. And I was one of the more mature guys over there. I mean, they call me Pops because I was older than a lot of them. Our commanding officer was 33 years old. So you can imagine that some of these 18, 19-year-old kids. And so, but it did change me in that I kind of became more serious about what life is really all about, and it gave me a tremendous sense of gratitude.
Yeah.
Because one of the things that I remember, that sense of gratitude hit me hard when I went to visit the Vietnam Wall the first time. And I'd been to it probably 10 or 12 times. But during that time in 1984, the wall had only been up for a couple of years. And I was looking for a couple of guys that I knew would be on the wall. And at the time, they had military people there that would help you look for the names and tell you what section they were on the wall. And today they have electronic that you can just go and find it very quickly. But I remember finding those names and how I had to reflect on, it was at nighttime, and the wall sits between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. And I just remember thinking, the first name on there is 1959, and the last one is 1975, and I'm like, wow, I went through what I went through, but these guys didn't make it. And so I think how it impacted me and maybe changed me is it gave me I always was a fairly grateful person, but I think that sense of gratitude was really amplified after I went through that, thinking that, why me? Why not those guys? So I think that's really how it changed me for the most part. Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your service. Yes. Thank you.
Brownwater Navy. The term Brownwater Navy originated during the American Civil War in the 1860s. To cripple the economy and area of operations of the Confederate States, Union General Winfield Scott prepared the Anaconda Plan, which involved blocking the harbors of the southern states and then pushing along the Mississippi River with Union forces. To achieve this, General Scott worked with the Navy to establish a new river force of terrifying ironclads and gunboats that would ravage Confederate forts and cities along the Mississippi. These boats were referred to as the Brownwater Navy because of the river's muddy appearance. Brownwater Navy boats were briefly used in China during the 1920s and 1930s as part of the American Asiatic Fleet. These American gunboats or riverboats patrolled Chinese rivers to safeguard foreign interests in the region. Still, most of them were captured after Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, and none were deployed during World War II or the Korean War. They would have to wait until the outbreak of the Vietnam War in 1965 to make a comeback. The River Patrol Force. During the first months of the Vietnam War, the U.S. Army and Marine Corps realized that taking control of the rivers that connected North and South Vietnam was vital. The North Vietnamese Army and their guerrilla, the Viet Cong, often used rivers to transport food, ammunition, weapons, and other supplies from one region to another without any American opposition. From simple sampans used by villagers to bigger boats, the enemy used these vessels to conceal supplies. Additionally, pirates and contrabandists infested river towns and cooperated with the communists. Consequently, on December 18, 1965, the United States Navy formally introduced the Brown Water Navy in Vietnam. The boats would be part of the River Patrol Force and the Mobile Riverine Force. Together, the U.S. Army and Navy would conduct joint operations to stop the flow of North Vietnamese troops, supplies, and communications into South Vietnam. The Army and Navy took inspiration from the Dina So, or French Riverine Force coastal patrols of the First Indochina War. The Mobile Riverine Force was tasked with not just fighting the enemy in the Vietnamese rivers, but also transporting soldiers, marines, and supplies to military outposts across Indochina. Also called the Riverines, their main base of operations was at Dong Tam Base Camp in the Mekong Delta River. Meanwhile, the River Patrol Force supported Task Force 116, a unit of 250 boats, most of which comprised the Patrol Boat Riverine Boat, or PBR. During the first months of 1966, the Brown Water Navy was composed of converted landing craft from World War II or modified small commercial boats. Still, the armed forces would quickly deliver authentic warboats with lethal equipment. Fighting the Mekong. The Army soldiers and Navy sailors that patrolled the rivers of Vietnam were tough men who fought at different combat fronts simultaneously. First and foremost, the men had to deal with the ambiance. Then there was the solitude. Once a boat made its way into inland waterways, they got little to no sun, and the sailors could only rely on their fellow boatmates. More importantly, there was the enemy, who knew the terrain well. The North Vietnamese were masters at blending with the jungles and forests, and like the many serpents found in Vietnam, they knew when to strike. River patrols were often attacked when they were most vulnerable, especially when patrol boat sailors stopped alongside Vietnamese sampans to check for contraband. The lightly armored boats were built for speed and constant movement, but lacked armored protection, and all types of grenades caused a lot of damage in the American ships. The most used gunboats were the Armored Troop Carrier, or ATC, the ASPB, and the Patrol Boat Riverine, or PBR. The PBR was the most used vehicle of them all, and was made of a small fiberglass hull and manned by a crew of 4. It saw action for the first time as part of Operation Game Warden in March of 1966 to deny the Viet Cong access to resources in the Mekong Delta. The River Patrol Boat. The small PBR patrol boat came in 2 variants, the Mark I and Mark II, the latter of which had a length of 12 feet, 1 foot longer than its predecessor. Both had a beam of 11.5 feet and a draft of 2 feet. The PBR displaced 14,600 pounds and was propelled by 2 jacuzzi water jet pumps, powered by 2 General Motors 220 horsepower diesel engines that resulted in speeds of over 20 and 30 knots. In addition, the boat was equipped with a Raytheon Pathfinder surface search radar and 2 AN/VRC-46 radios. In the hands of an able captain, the PBR was fast, highly maneuverable, and responsive. Offensive armament comprised a twin 50 caliber machine gun in a forward turret and a single 50 caliber MG located aft. Plus, a 40mm grenade launcher and an M60 machine gun were found on port and starboard amidships. The 31-foot fiberglass hull was resistant to tornado worms and other marine borers found in the Vietnamese rivers. Still, it was not immune to shrapnel from RPGs and other explosives, but armor plates did protect the engines and the coxswain's flat. The 4-man crew comprised a boat captain, seaman, engine man, and gunner's mate, all of whom often carried M16s, shotguns, M79 grenade launchers, a Starlight night vision device, and a 60mm mortar. James E. Williams. It was common to spot Navy lieutenants commanding river patrol operations across the Mekong. Such patrols often comprised 2 boats to face the enemies together. The soldiers and sailors were used to being overwhelmed and outnumbered by the North Vietnamese, but what they lacked in manpower, they made up for in firepower. Still, the PBR boats were highly vulnerable when they turned on their searchlights during night operations. The heroism of PBR crews was admirable. Historian and river water veteran Tom Cutler said that the PBR, quote, proved to be a fierce little combatant. The boats and the men who fought in them were truthfully characterized as proud, brave, and reliable. And Petty Officer First Class James E. Williams, in command of River Patrol Boat 105, was one of them. In May of 1966, Williams was assigned to the River Patrol Force and given command of PBR 105. Then, on October 31st, he was given a specific mission to hunt down Viet Cong guerrillas located in an isolated sector of the Mekong Delta near Mai Tu. When PBR 105 and PBR 107 approached the area, the duo was greeted by small arms fire from a hostile sampan. Williams ordered them to return the fire, and they eliminated one of the enemy occupants. Still, the sampan fled to an adjacent smaller river, and they went after it. Little did they know that they were walking straight into a trap. Survival. As the two PBRs went after the damaged enemy sampan, they were greeted by a second one emerging from the waterway. The enemy sampan crew then opened fire with their AK-47 rifles and RPK machine guns, prompting a pursuit that quickly turned into a full-fledged combat encounter. Moments later, Williams ordered both boats to flee the waterway, but it was too late. A heavy volume of assault rifle and machine gun fire began pummeling the two American boats from well-concealed positions on both sides of the riverbanks. Williams then ordered his men to fire at will with everything they had. As the men fought their way out of the trap, the PBRs were confronted by more hostile Viet Cong, armed to the teeth aboard two junks. PBR 105 and PBR 107 were outnumbered and outgunned in a matter of minutes. And to make matters worse, over 8 other sampans showed up behind the two junks. Williams then got in the way of the hostile fire to help his men direct their mortar rounds and grenade launcher shots to where the enemy concentrated the most. He knew mobility was vital to survive the onslaught and made a shocking decision, calling his comrades to break through the enemy formation at top speed. The two patrol boats then crashed at high speed right through the Viet Cong formation, smashing some sampans along the way and sending enemy soldiers into the water. Soon after, Williams repositioned PBR 105 and 107 and continued firing 50 caliber rounds toward the enemies, who were still recovering from the Americans' unexpected maneuvers. Williams then called on air support through the radio as the crewmen continued firing their M16s and grenade launchers to decimate the approaching Viet Cong. However, it was going to take some time for the helicopters to arrive. Valuable time that Williams and his men lacked as they sighted an even more significant concentration of hostile enemy boats coming to encircle them. River Patrol Boat 105. As Williams and his men were tearing apart the wooden sampans by the dozens, it was time to move out before they were entirely surrounded. Once again, PBR 105 and PBR 107 raced through the enemy boats, and they had a close call with an RPG round that damaged their hulls with shrapnel. Still, the boats were ready to go. Williams kept ordering his men to concentrate fire on the closest enemy boats to take them down more efficiently, which they did with devastating effect. As more than 50 enemy sampans started to sink, the Viet Cong casualties began to mount. Wounded and drained by the adrenaline, Williams and his crewmen kept firing until their main ammunition began to run dry. Soon, UH-1 Huey helicopters showed up to support the patrol boats, and the Hueys began to clean up the river with their M60s and rocket launchers. Williams and his men then returned to the ambush area to finish the surviving enemies. By then, night had fallen, and he ordered his men to turn the boat searchlights on to spot the Viet Cong. While the helicopters focused on the river craft, the two patrol boats got dangerously close to the shore to better illuminate the area and eliminate the enemies hiding there. The crewmen then engaged them with their M16s, combat shotguns, and their last mortar rounds. After 3 hours of relentless combat, the river ambush was finally over. The survivors had run away, and over 65 enemy boats had been destroyed, with over 1,000 enemy casualties. James E. Williams was awarded the Medal of Honor on May 14, 1968, for his courage and leadership shown during the October 1, 1966 patrol mission. Meanwhile, the Brown Water Navy and its brave Army and Navy crews would continue fighting across the rivers of Vietnam, and many patrol boats would become essential for delivering and extracting special forces, such as the Green Berets and MACV-SOG personnel, during classified operations as the war came to an end.